welcome back to part 2 of the second chapter. Moving on, we're just gonna get right into it. Also, the creator has began making the sequel, so that's amazing. I am very excited for that. Very happy. Moving on. Let's just continue on chapter 2 of whatever the chapter 2 is called, because I don't remember. So, chapter 2 of Bad Senses and Eragon. Half of the Bad Senses were jolted awake by an unexpected roar, which seemed to wake Eragon as well. Er was already up, as he didn't sleep. He was holding the elderly man named Brom in place as he convulsed on the floor. Blueberry rushed up, held his hand to the human's forehead before Eragon could. "Oh, he's hot! He's very hot!" he muttered worriedly. Eragon ordered Murtoff to get water and cloth as Blue tried sending some healing magic into the old man. Era shared a look with Cross and Nightmare. They knew the human was going to die. They couldn't heal poison. Whenever one of the teammates got poisoned, they were always taken to Dock Sands. That was an entirely different multiverse. Brom was going to die. The human suddenly woke, staring at Eragon. "You, bring me wineskin." "Brom, you shouldn't drink wine. It'll only make you worse." "Bring it, boy. Just bring it." "I'll be right back. Here." Dust already found it, smelling the alcohol inside. Eragon took it and kneeled in front of his teacher. "I have the wine." "Good." He weakly lifted up one of his arms. "Now, wash my right hand with it." "What?" "No questions. I haven't time." Confused, the boy complied, rubbing the old man's hand vigorously. More. The others moved away, leaving the two alone while listening. Only Nightmare and Blue remained, one standing there while the other kept sending his green healing magic into the human frantically. The brown dye started washing off his palm. Eragon scrubbed harder, then froze when he saw a shimmering mark much like his own. Given what he explained about the mark, it meant he was a writer. Blue glanced at Nightmare for confirmation, who only widened his socket. "You're a writer?" Eragon breathed. "Once upon a time that was true, but no more. When I was young, younger than you are now, I was chosen by the writers to join their ranks. While they trained me, I became friends with another apprentice, Morzon, before he was a Forsworn." Eragon gasped at this. "Didn't he say that was over a few hundred years ago? How old was this human?" "But then he betrayed us to Galbetrix, and in the fight at Duri Abru, Voragard City, my young dragon was killed. Her name was Saphira." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Eragon whispered. "Because there was no need to," Brom told him as he struggled to breathe, clenching his fists. Blue shaking his skull, holding back tears. "I am old, Eragon. So old. Though my dragon was killed, my life has been much longer than most. You don't know what it is to reach my age, look back, and realize you don't remember much of it. Then to look ahead and know how many years still lie ahead of you. After all this time, I still grieve for my Saphira. I hate Galbetrix for what he tore from me." He leaned forward for a moment, eyes bulging as he insisted feverishly. "Don't let that happen to you. Don't. Guard Saphira with your life, for without her it's hardly worth living." "You shouldn't talk like this. Nothing's going to happen to her." Eragon's voice cracked. He turned his head to the side. "Perhaps I am rambling." He blindly passed his gaze over to the others near the entrance of the cave, and Nightmare before refocusing on Eragon. "Eragon, I cannot last much longer. This grievous world, it saps my strength. I do not have the energy to fight it." But I healed it, human. I healed you." "Before I go, will you take my blessing?" Blue started crying for real at that, Eragon close behind. "Everything will be all right. You don't have to do this." "It is the way of things. I must. Will you take my blessing?" Eragon dipped his head, tears flowing. The older one weakly reached up and gripped his brow. "Then I give it to you. May the year's coming strength bring you great happiness." Then, weakly motioned he draw nearer. Eragon complied. His whispers were loud to the skeletons. Nightmare and Blue hearing strange words, then only Blueberry hearing them for their meaning, which he pretended not to after staring at Nightmare for a long moment. Then Brom tilted his head to stare blindly at the ceiling. And now, for the greatest adventure of all. Blue and Eragon broke down, Skeleton throwing himself into Nightmare for some kind of comfort. Then the goopy one sighed, then guided him to the entrance, where he handed him to Error, the other glitching and glaring, "What the fuck?" face. Nightmare ignored him and retreated into the darkness, staring by the humans. I can take his pain away," he murmured. Eragon wiped his tear-streaked face up. "I can only take his pain. I cannot do anything else." The human nodded shakily. The king of negativity rested his hand on Brom's forehead, a purple glow emanating from it and into the skin. Then his face looked relaxed, peaceful. Nightmare walked away quietly, his tentacles still for once. He glanced at the others, their faces ranged from shocked, confused, and depressed. "I have more than enough negativity to give more than one little gift," he explained without meeting their eyes. Truth be told, he felt a little sympathetic. There was so much negativity here. At first he loved it, but quickly Nightmare felt a tugging on his soul. It was too much. This place not be his world, but it was completely out of balance. It was ingrained into the core of his being to keep the balance, even after all this time of trying to upset it. It put a lot of things into perspective. So now Nightmare had a lot of time to reflect while Eragon mourned Brom. The old man was his father, he knew. He knew what a father's blessing was, and Brom had given it to him desperately whilst lying on his deathbed. "Sitcher una morana, Churchgrill." The mysterious words echoed through his mind, and Nightmare sat back up. Eric glanced at him in confusion, like he heard it well, but unlike the glitchy skeleton, Nightmare somehow knew the meanings behind these words. And Eric could tell. Nightmare spoke quietly, loud enough for the skeletons to hear. "Rest in peace, Dragon Rider." The others perked up temporarily, then settled back down as it set in. Era pulled up a holographic keyboard and screen, typing up the words he had seen in his mind and the translation Nightmare miraculously had, which brought up a good question. Why did Nightmare know this language? He couldn't think of anything. After a while, he gave up, tired of thinking. Instead, he stretched out his magic and his consciousness. Blue and the other skeletons recognized his magic and were unbothered, but the human Murtoff immediately tensed up and blocked his mind. Nightmare wasn't trying to pry in there. That was unnecessary, unless he had something to hide. Or was it natural for minds to read through thoughts upon contact here? The Dark One made note of this and went on. Souls didn't seem to exist here, or at least, not that he knew of them. There was energy, lots of energy. Both magic, ethereal, and natural, mundane. And these minds were much easier to see. This land, Alasthesia, it was truly quite fascinating. While it had some similarities to their multiverse, it was very different as well. Some of the very laws of physics seems to be different here. Perhaps he will pore over some books later, when he finds them. Perhaps he'll get lucky. The humans here already had a history book. That's unlikely. Eragon was uneducated. Brom had to teach him how to read and write. Wait, didn't he mention a book? Well, maybe Nightmare was lucky. Murtoff? He got up and looked at the human, who stared back, anger in his mind, but his face was emotionless. "I won't ask Eragon, as he is mourning. So I ask you, where are his things? I wish to borrow that book he mentioned." The human jerked his hand inside the cave. Nightmare nodded his thanks and disappeared into the depths of the cave, quiet for Eragon's sake. He found the packs, rummaging through them as silently as he could. His hand brushed across a leather cover bound around a parchment. With a satisfied smirk, he pulled out a delectably thick book and read the title. Dama Abra Wedra, Dominance of Fate. There it was again, the sudden recognition and automatic translation. Nightmare shook his skull, ignoring the fact that it was getting easier. He moved back to the entrance, leaning on the wall and opening the first page, not before taking a moment to enjoy the craftsmanship and smell of the parchment paper and ink. He smiled a little, pleased with the idea of spending the day reading about this land's history and races. And so, the morning slid into afternoon, the others gathering around Nightmare as they asked him to tell them about the world that they were now lost in, the epics of Alasthesia. He happily obliged, letting Eric copy the contents of the thick book into his notes to study by himself and theorize. At one point in early evening, Eragon called out Brahm's name and cried for help, a stark reminder that someone was dying with only a boy by his side. The old man had gone stiff now. He stared at Eragon one last time, smiling. He sighed, never to breathe again. The human stood after closing those lifeless eyes. His dragon tilted back her head and roaring into the vaulting sky, a lamentation for the dead. The others were touched, though they didn't know the storyteller or the human at all. Each whispered their own words of passing, unheard in the dragon's keening. Then Eragon spoke, his voice unsteady. "We have to bury him." "We might be seen," Murtaugh warned, but was cut off. "I don't care." The other human hesitated, but Cross honored Eragon's wish, picking up the body after a glance at Nightmare. Blue picked up the sword and staff beside him, wanting to carry something. "To the top." "What?" Dust deadpanned. "We can't dig a grave out of stone." "I can do it." Cross just teleported, the others joining. Eragon stumbled, wiped his eyes, fixating on the stone and waving his hand. "More stunner." The stone rippled as it became like water, then flowed like a liquid to form an empty grave, waist-high walls around it. He took the body from Cross and laid it in the depression, then taking the weapons from Blue and laying them in there as well. At last he stepped back and shaped the stone back, adding a facade spire, much like a gravestone, which he engraved the runes. "Here lies Brahm, who was a dragon rider and like a father to me. May his name live on in glory." The Sanses glanced at one another and Murtaugh, then stayed there for a little while longer. This was the first human funeral for most of them, so they remained. Nightmare was the first to move. He reached over with a tentacle and wrote in elegant calligraphy the words that continued to echo in his mind at the foot of the grave. "Stare una marjana, sure turkle." No rain will wash these words away. They will remain forevermore. The offering prompted Era to move as well. The glitch pulled the strings from his eye sockets. Then they glowed a little brighter as they wove around the edges of the grave outlined in the fire, and there they remained, glowing softly. Then Blue stirred. He placed a golden bone at the base of the grave, his blue tears dripping onto the sandstone, also glowing before fading into the rock. Dust added a tiny blaster skull, its sockets dark as it will never fire a laser. Cross added an X below Nightmare's inscription, then Killer a knife after some thought. Murtaugh stood there, not knowing what to give since everyone else had gifted something. The gang slowly filed off, vanishing into the cave below them with a quiet attitude once again. Many of them may be murderers, but this was something else. The evil humor in the air felt toxic, and they wanted it gone. Finally, Killer quietly suggested they finish Damia Abra Wadra to pass the time. They all agreed, anything to take their minds off the intense depression in the air. Even Nightmare was sick of it. This was too much misery. This world was hell, unlike what he had always believed before. He did not like it. In fact, he rather hated it. Before they went on where they left off, Nightmare silently promised that he was going to right the balance of this world. Unbeknownst to him, the others were quietly promising that they would help Eragon in any way they could, which in the end would lead ultimately to the same goal. And that is the end of the second chapter. Yep, okay. It was like 10 minutes worth of audio. What could have been 10 minutes worth of audio if I could speak is now like 30. So, yeah. Lots of editing. Hate the spider. I'm just gonna end it here. Due to editing, you're not gonna know what the spider is until I do the bloopers. Anyways, you'll understand later. Bye.